to attend today. My name is Jack Johnston. I'm the Corporate Affairs and Media Manager at MLA, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. The team presenting today is Stephen Bignell, MLA's Manager for NLRS and Market Information, Aaron Lukey, Senior Market Information Analyst, Emily Tan, Market Information Analyst, and Tim Jackson, our Global Supply Analyst. I'll just quickly pass over to the team now to give us a quick introduction each before the presentation. Steve, can you please kick us off?
Thanks, Jack. So as you said, I'm Steve Bignell, MLA's Market Information and NLRS Manager. So in our team, we're responsible for all supply, production and pricing insights up to the processor. And in the NLRS arm, look after market reports and all the indicators. And a bit about me, I'm originally from a merino mixed cropping enterprise in Coachnup, WA.
Thank you, Aaron.
Hi everyone, Aaron Lukey, MLA Senior Market Information Analyst. Been with the organisation for around 18 months now. I focus on domestic supply and demand, analysing prices, but then also a strong focus on a lot of our information reports that are published, including these projection documents.
Thank you, Aaron. Emily.
Yeah, my name's Emily Tan. I'm the Market Information Analyst. I work very closely with Aaron and Steve looking at a lot of market information reports. So in particular, I look after the Beef Producers Intention Survey, as well as the Sheep Producers Intention Survey, as well as looked after by Aaron. Passing on to Tim.
Hi, Tim Jackson. I'm the Global Supply Analyst at MLA, and what I primarily look at is what's happening in other countries from a kind of supply and production perspective, and what that means for global supply and what that means for Australia, kind of as a global exporter of red meat and of lamb and mutton in particular. And I look at global trade flows and our exports and where they're going and all of those sorts of things.
Brilliant, thank you, Tim. The team's contact information is made available here and at the end of the webinar. If you have any supply, price or production related inquiries, please reach out. Be happy to assist. Before we start, I'll just cover a few housekeeping points. You'll all be on mute and cameras will be off. Questions, there'll be allocated time for questions at the end of the presentation. Feel free to enter your questions at any time by scanning the QR code, which will appear on each slide, which will take you to our Slido platform. There you'll have the opportunity to ask questions, and if you wish to remain anonymous, you can. Please note that this webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the recording will be made available onto MLA's website and YouTube channel if you wish to rewatch or share the webinar. Alrighty, now we'll kick off with the webinar proper. So the MLA industry projections documents are a long-standing initiative from MLA, providing the red meat industry with insight into the major influences on the red meat sector for the short to medium term. For relating to sheep, however, as you may all be aware, the ABS has not released 2023 and 2024 flock figures as yet. As we know, they've been through a modernisation process. So in lieu of that, Steve, how has this impacted your projections process, and what does this mean for our headline figures?
Thanks, Jack. So for 2025, as you said, the MLA projections document is a major document that MLA produce, and as such, there's a rigorous process in developing them. And it's a process that we've been carrying out for over 25 years. And what its aim is it's meant to provide insights on supply, inventory, and meat availability for everyone along the supply chain, be that producers, processors, and exporters. And what we do as part of this process is we consult widely with industry, again, across the supply chain. And what we're really trying to see is what are the drivers impacting sheep numbers and inventories and production. What this document will do is we're going to look at, or what the document does do, is it looks at flock, slaughter, carcass weights, production, export and live exports for a 3-year period. What we do, as I said, the forecasts go through our model and then they're sense checked by the broad consultation. And what that allows us to do is just to validate the outputs and ensure they're representative of industry. The document is released twice a year, first in March and then in September, and that's so that we can reflect what has happened during the year. If there's any changes that occur in the first half of the year, we have to update them. And the date that they're released on is set by when the ABS release their slaughter and production data. As you mentioned, Jack, the ABS is currently modelising the agricultural statistics format that they use, and why they're trying to do or modernise and change their reporting is they're trying to reduce the reporting burden on farmers, improve the quality of statistics, and improve coordination of the whole agricultural stats ecosystem. That said, the ABS hasn't updated the flock numbers for 2023 and 2024, and so not caveat, but MLA is utilising a 2022 ABS flock number as the base figure for forecasting the flock here. ABS plans to update their flock by June 2025, and in doing so, they will have and retrospectively have flock numbers for 2023 and 2024. And what this means is that if there's any change to the ABS baseline, this will be reflected not in this March release, but in our September update numbers.
Great, thank you, Steve. Can you please please now run us through the key points of the sheep projections document?
Yep, so the 4 key points that we're going to cover in this document will be around the flock or supply, slaughter, production and carcass weight. So from a flock perspective, the flock is estimated to ease 7.4% this year to 23.5 million head in 2025. When we look at slaughter, lamb slaughter and sheep slaughter are expected to ease, but they're coming off historically high levels in 2024. Lamb slaughter is expected to ease slightly, very minimally, to 26.2 million head, and sheep slaughter will ease by 16% to 9.8 million head. But it's important to, especially when we're looking at lamb slaughter, to know that we're entering a period of a new normal, and we expect lamb slaughter for the whole forecast period to be above 25 million head. When we look at production, which is the third factor or theme we're going to cover today, lamb and sheep production will follow the slaughter trend in easing slightly, but their availability of meat over the next 3 years will remain high. Like we said, we're in a new normal period of high production. And from a carcass weights perspective, lamb carcass weights are expected to remain flat at 24 kilos, but we're going to see sheep carcass weights lift to 25.5 kilos per carcass this year, as we see more non-merino mutton start to flow through the system.
Moving through the document, these headline figures are informed by a number of assumptions covering financial considerations and climate, as well as cost of inputs and employment. Erin will please take us through the major assumptions which will impact businesses in 2025.
Brilliant. So the macroeconomic environment is definitely a big influence on producer decision making. The RBA recently announced a 0.25 percentage point reduction to the cash rate to 4.1%, which is the first reduction since November 2020. After experiencing the fastest monetary tightening cycle in pretty much a generation, this will likely ease the pressure on households, but then also lower interest rates may encourage producers and the supply chain participants to take on additional debt and ease the pressure of servicing existing debts. To employment, a loosening economic policy is likely to keep unemployment low. For the agricultural industry individually, the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme, or the PALM scheme, has been a really important and essential tool for industry to build up the workforce, addressing some shortages. The scheme currently employs over 25,000 people in agriculture and meat processing. It's the largest cohort for the scheme. However, we're seeing more businesses relying on the scheme to alleviate these labour shortages, which has led to a formalisation of that labour, which has resulted in increased overhead labour costs and labour becoming more of a fixed cost, constraining the flexibility of the workforce. To ESG, so in the development of this document, ESG was raised across a number of our consultations. It appears to be front of mind across the whole supply chain, from processors, exporters, producers, and retailers. Australia is implementing mandatory reporting standards, and we've heard some organisations have adopted these standards already, while others are monitoring its progress and keeping a close eye on those standards. Additionally, compliance across a range of programs outside of ESG is essential to maintain market access, particularly for exporters. However, this could cause an increase to compliance costs. Major players in the ag space are trying to get on the front foot of this and invest in programs and consumer market requests.
Thank you, Erin. Climate is a vital factor in the agricultural space, and thus it's very important to get right, as this has major impacts on businesses, as we all know. In 2024, we witnessed that the southern region, particularly South Australia and Victoria, endured drier conditions compared to northern states. Erin, will this have an impact on the outlook for this year?
Yep, so definitely climate is probably the largest influence on numbers and has a huge impact on how far those swings are. As you mentioned, the north and south have experienced very different conditions. Regions across South Australia and the Western Districts of Victoria in that red circle have faced dry conditions for the past 18 months, and then recent bomb reports are showing little relief in the next couple of months. Ultimately, generally, New South Wales, when we think about the entire state, has faced relatively strong conditions over 2024, which has influenced a lot more interstate trading of stock and provided a strong base for some regions in 2025. So, as climate is the main driver, these projections are based off short-term and medium-term climate assumptions, which is quite difficult to do. This year, the southern climate outcomes are expected to improve slightly on last year, reducing turn-off, though we're not forecasting it to kickstart a rebuild in those southern states. Despite improvement, the 3-month forecast for average rainfall will not reverse the impacts of the missed summer, and producers are expected to remain cautious around stocking rates in those impacted areas. Moving forward, for our model input, an assumption has been made for 2 average years in 2026 and 2027 as the basis of this forecast.
Thank you, Erin. Moving on to the flock, MLA's projection process is focused on supply side forecasts. For historic figures, as we mentioned before, MLA utilises ABS actuals for the herd, slaughter and exports and others. As mentioned before, we are anticipating an update to the ABS flock later this year. In lieu of this, Emily, are you able to provide us with an overview of the forecasted flock figures from 2025 to 2027?
Thanks, Jack. Starting with the flock numbers, the 2025 national sheep flock will remain in decline by 5.9 million head, or 7.4% to 73.2 million head. After reaching the largest flock in over a decade in 2024, the industry witnessed an increased turn-off of mutton at the end of last year, after these older breeding ewes had been retained over the rebuild. Dry conditions in Western Victoria and Southern South Australia further contributed to high mutton supply. Despite the high mutton turn-off of the flock is expected to remain relatively stable in 2026 and 2027. In 2026, the flock is forecast to ease by 1.8% to 71.9 million head and will lift by 3% to 74.1 million head by 2027.
Flock is easing over this forecasted period. Emily, what does this mean for lamb and sheep slaughter?
So, with the flock expected to ease over the forecasted period, lamb slaughter in 2025 is forecast to reach 26.2 million head, a slight decline from 2024. This still represents the second largest slaughter year on record behind 2024. Given the elevated levels of sheep slaughter at the end of 2024, it's expected that the lambs that weren't processed last year will be processed in the first months of 2025. So, despite slaughter easing over the forecasted period, slaughter continues to remain at historically high levels. 2026 slaughter is expected to ease by 3% to 25.3 million head and rise in 2027 by 0.7% to 25.7 million head. Production is expected to remain high from productivity improvements.
And sheep?
So with sheep in 2024, sheep slaughter hit 11.8 million head. And sheep slaughter obviously cannot remain at these levels, otherwise we'll see a significant reduction in the breeding ewe flock. Sheep slaughter is forecast to decline in 2025 by 16.9% to 9.8 million head, following the earlier than expected turnoff of older breeding ewes. In 2026, sheep slaughter is expected to rebound by 2.3% to 10 million head and rise again in 2027 by 2.8% to 10.3 million head.
Thank you. You mentioned that lamb slaughter would remain above historically high levels. How does this impact lamb and sheep production?
Yeah, so lamb production in 2025 is projected to reach 628,000 tonnes. Production will remain at these historically high levels, despite it easing slightly by 0.1% from 2024. High slaughter rates are what driving this production increase, opposed to increasing carcass weights, which has led to this sustained high level of production, ensuring a steady supply of lambs throughout the year. In 2026, lamb production is expected to decline by 1.8% to 617,000 tonnes before rebounding to 631,000 tonnes in 2027. Moving on to sheep production, as a result of that increased supply of mutton that we saw in 2024, mutton supply in 2025 is forecast to ease by 16% to 250,000 tonnes. Despite mutton production declining, it is mainly due to fewer sheep being processed, while sheep carcass weights are continuing to lift. Staying on the topic of production, in 2026, it will increase by 4% to 260,000 tonnes and continue to lift in 2027 to 272,000 tonnes. With sheep production easing over the forecasted period, sheep carcass weights will continue to remain strong. In 2025, they will lift by 1.4% to 25.5 kilos in 2025 and continue to lift in 2026 to 26 kilos and another 0.4 kilos in 2027.
Brilliant. Thank you, Emily. Thank you for the domestic overview and forecasts for the sheep sector here. Before I move on to the next session, just a reminder that if you have any questions, please use the QR code on your screen to access the Slido app. Feel free to send those in at any time throughout the presentation. We'll now head over to Tim, who will walk us through the live export numbers and the global supply outlook. Firstly, we'll start with live ex, Tim.
We are forecasting a steady lift in live export numbers over the forecast period. In 2024, exports were lower than expected, in large part due to significant supply chain disruption. Given the resolution of several of these impediments towards the end of the year, we expect that volumes will correct in 2025, with exports rising 25% to 540,000 head. Following that, we expect a marginal increase of exports in 2026 to 550,000 head, followed by a larger increase in 2027 to 600,000 head as supply improves. With that said, as the chart shows, it is unlikely that live exports will return to historic long-run averages over the forecast period. There are several reasons for this. Firstly, Western Australia has seen very tough conditions over the past few seasons, and adult sheep slaughter rose to a 15-year high in 2024. While these projections are aggregated at a national level, we know from the Sheep Producer Intention Survey that the West Australian percentage of the flock has shrunk relative to the national total. Secondly, there is an ongoing shift in the genetic composition of the sheep flock away from wool breeds and towards meat breeds. This tilts the age profile of the flock younger. Instead of keeping wethers around to get a fleece, lambs are more likely to be processed. Taken together, these two factors have reduced the available supply of adult sheep for live export. The third reason, on the demand side, is that terrorist activity around the Strait of Hormuz continues to pose considerable logistical challenges to accessing Australia's largest live sheep export markets, which pose an ongoing challenge to the supply chain and constrains exports. Fourth, on the demand side, given the probability of a flock rebuild on the east coast and South Australia, Available breeding ewes and rams in WA will potentially be attractive stock for restocking in the second half of the forecast period. Taken together, this means that although numbers will rise, they will not rise to or above the long-run average over the forecast period.
Thanks, Tim, for that summary on live export. Can we talk to a more global picture? As we know, after Australia, New Zealand is the second largest sheep meat exporter in the world and the primary competitor to Australia for lamb on the world stage. What's the outlook for this Kiwi flock and what does it mean for our flock?
In terms of supply, we can expect that New Zealand's sheep meat production and exports will fall over the coming year and either fall further or at a minimum remain subdued for the next several years. The New Zealand sheep flock contracted by 3% in 2024 to under 24 million head, which follows a pattern. This is the 11th consecutive year of flock decline. What's more, preliminary survey data from Beef and Lamb New Zealand suggests that the lamb crop in spring 2024 was around 5% smaller than the 2023 crop, meaning that the available supply of lambs for slaughter is likely to be smaller in the coming year. This points to lower production. Since New Zealand exports more than 90% of its sheep meat production, any reduction in New Zealand production translates quite directly into lower exports. This will have two effects for Australia. Firstly, it will generally reduce supply in the global market. Together, Australia and New Zealand make up over 80% of globally traded sheep meat. So any reduction in New Zealand supply has a direct effect on the total amount of sheep meat exported overall. Secondly, it will provide specific opportunities for Australian lamb exporters in key markets where we compete with New Zealand directly. Australia competes for market share with New Zealand in China, in the United States, and in the United Kingdom. While lower exports from New Zealand will temporarily reduce supply broadly and thus boost demand for Australian product, the opportunity to build up market share could potentially have a longer-term impact. As discussed earlier by Steve, Erin, and Emily, Australian lamb production is set to remain high over the forecast period and potentially outside of that. Given the stability of production volumes and quality of production evident in Australian lamb, lower exports from New Zealand provide a real opportunity to introduce new customers to Australian lamb and build enduring market share.
Well, thank you, Tim. Changing to another market, the United Kingdom has been a fast-growing market for lamb, but is also a considerable producer and exporter in their own right. How does this work, and what does that mean for Australia?
The United Kingdom has reasonably consistent demand for lamb, but domestic production is heavily seasonal and subject to cyclical rebuild destock dynamics of the type that you'd expect to see in any flock. That means that at times the UK produces a surplus of lamb domestically, and other times it doesn't produce enough to meet its own domestic needs. So the solution to this has been to engage in trade. Essentially, the UK exports some chilled lamb into the EU with volumes determined by domestic production levels at the time, and concurrently imports lamb during periods of lower supply. Traditionally, most of this imported lamb has been frozen legs from New Zealand. There are two ongoing changes that shift this dynamic. Firstly, as I discussed earlier, New Zealand production is likely to decline in the short term, and the smaller flock means a substantial volume in volumes is unlikely. Compounding this, New Zealand has become a major lamb exporter to China over the past decade, so the amount of lamb available for export into the UK is being squeezed, both on the supply side and on the demand side. Secondly, the medium-term outlook for the British sheep flock is mixed. The flock reached a new low of 31 million head in June 2024, and production has slipped over the past few years. The Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board is forecasting a 2% lift in production next year, but this would actually just push supply back up to the levels that we saw in 2022. The stability in production and slowly shrinking flock over the past few years suggests that future domestic supply will likely remain tight. Despite this, demand remains strong, which is why imports from Australia have lifted since the Australia-UK Free Trade Agreement came into effect. As such, the opportunity for Australia is to capitalise on the favourable supply and demand fundamentals on display and meaningfully build market share in the UK market over the next few years.
Great. Thank you very much, Tim, for that. I'm going to move on to our objections document now. Again, a reminder, if you have any questions, there are some coming through already, which is great. Please scan the QR code and enter it in. We'll now discuss price forecasting that's been published in this report. As MLA, where we do not participate in price forecasting ourselves, the team has taken the opportunity to approach top-tier industry analysts for their independent forecasts for the prices. Erin, can you please elaborate on what these analysts see happening in the sheet market?
Sure. So we know the industry love a price forecast, but MLA does not do price forecasting ourselves. So the projections document is that opportunity for external analysts across industry to provide us their forecast, and we aggregate that and publish it within the document. So this year we had participants from Rural Bank, Rabobank, Mercado, and they all provided their forecast to us for 3 key National Livestock Reporting Service lamb indicators, which were the heavy lamb indicator, trade lamb, and restocker lamb. So based on the current market price, analysts are forecasting out to 30 June, and they see the heavy lamb indicator rising 4% from current prices to 842 cents per kilo carcass weight. The trade lamb indicator lifting 11% from current to 820.5 cents per kilo carcass weight, and the restocker lamb forecasted to ease 6% from current prices, reaching 695.5 cents per kilo carcass weights. So we know stakeholders value these forecasts, but as Jack said, it's important to note these are not generated by MLA. They are aggregated averages, and we really value the participation from these organisations and analysts in providing this information to us.
Thank you very much, Erin. Steve, just closing up with you, what does the future hold?
Thanks, Jack. So I suppose the first stage is to look at where we've come from. So we're coming off the highest flock in 15 years at 79 million head. So we're coming from a pretty strong position when we consider supply. But where are we going? Looking ahead, processors have increased capacity and now have steady labour, which is something that Erin and Em have talked about. So this investment in labour has incentivised processors to keep production levels high. If they've if we've seen a bit of formalisation in labour and they've an investment, they want to keep production high. So we do see that, and then that is translating to what we're seeing: higher slaughter over the production period, especially of lamb. What we expect with that lamb slaughter remaining high over the production forecast period is we're keeping lamb at sort of record highs, even though the breeding flock is changing. And the main reason for that is we're seeing a huge composition, and Tim touched on it and everyone's touched on it, seeing a change in the composition of the flock in terms of breeds. And what that leads to is a change in fertility. So we're able to produce more lamb off a smaller flock. So that's why we have the production of lamb staying quite stable, even though we see the flock easing. So that's sort of the main thing. We're sort of in this new normal of lamb slaughter. And then I suppose all that means is that we sort of finished out with Tim, is we're entering a period of high production which puts Australia in a really strong position in the global markets, especially when there's a red meat shortage. When we look at the US beef deficit that they're going into, New Zealand sheep meat flock decline. So all in all, it means Australia's going to have a lot of lamb production over the forecast period at a time when red meat will be demand will be strong, which puts Australia in a really, really good position.
That's great. Thanks very much, Steve. That comes to the end of the running through the projections document itself. We've got loads of questions in the Slido already, which is fantastic. Please feel free to send some more in as we run through them. I'll just go through to the questions now. The first one, this might go to Emily. Are the higher levels of slaughter for the next few years driven by domestic or export demand?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we're going to see high slaughter rates remain at those levels, given that we've seen growth in processing capacity, as well as just improved genetics and fertility over the last couple of years with the incorporation of more sheep meat breeds into the flock. And I think most certainly part of it will be, we'll see usually when there's increased supply, there's a slight lift in domestic consumption as well, but a large part of it will be that export demand, as you saw with the New Zealand flock slightly declining. But I'll pass on to Tim if he's got any more insights regarding that.
So export demand looks to be quite strong over the coming years. I think, as Steve mentioned in his kind of what the future holds section, it is quite likely that particularly over the next year and out in the forecast period, overseas demand is likely to be reasonably robust just from a kind of competitive supply perspective. Touched on New Zealand, which is likely to see lower slaughter and lower exports for lamb specifically, in proteins more broadly. Beef exports from the United States, or beef production from the United States and Brazil is likely to decline this year. And so that means that just from that competitive supply perspective and what that means for total supply and demand, we're in a fairly favourable position. But ultimately, these projections are at their core supply-oriented documents. They're based on, kind of the numbers available, and then the dynamics of the flock at the time, what that means for slaughter, what that means for carcass weight, and then we kind of temper that with the demand side factors, with those global factors. But certainly the picture over the next few years in international markets, at least from that demand perspective, is looking like less supply and thus higher demand for available stock.
Great. Thank you very much, Tim and Emily. Emily, I'll go back to you for the next question. How are lamb and mutton kill numbers this year tracking against the same time last year?
Yeah, so mutton, as I've mentioned, slaughter, we're going to see those elevated slaughter, but for lamb slaughter, according to the NRLS, it is 5% above 2024 slaughter figures. We're seeing average weekly slaughter just around 500,000 head, give or take. So we're seeing those lambs that weren't processed at the end of last year come through now. Regarding mutton slaughter, we saw mutton slaughter at the end of 2024 averaging about 220 to 250,000 head a week. And we're seeing a slight slowdown at the moment compared to that kind of record levels of numbers. So we're seeing at the moment weekly slaughter for mutton is about 200 to 220,000 head a week. So still huge numbers. And when you compare it to the same time last year, that's 18% above those figures last year. So we're still seeing huge numbers of mutton go through, but as well as a slight increase in lamb supply through the processor as well. We're seeing mutton for the first 2 months of the year, averaging about 30% of total slaughter. So still big numbers that are going through the processors at the moment.
Right, thank you, Emily. Probably going to go to you again. The next one. Why are carcass grades expected to grow year on year?
So at the moment, I think part of the reason why we're forecasting carcass weights will growing year on year is the fact that we're seeing a lot of supply and processors being more selective, looking at processing heavier lambs, heavier sheep. And part of that is obviously the yield that you can get on a heavier animal. And so that's why we're forecasting more heavier sheep, going up heavier carcass weights for sheep because of that. And, because there's such an increase in supply at the moment.
And just to add on that, is, as Em said in her first answer, is we're starting to see that composition of non-merinos end up as adult sheep. So we've definitely seen a move out of merinos to sheep meat breeds. And as those animals hit mutton age, they're obviously pulling that carcass weight up. So we definitely expect that trend to see those animals move through the supply chain.
Thanks, Emily and Steve. Tim, this one's going to go over for you. Has MLA incorporated an estimate for live sheep exports to Morocco in its projections? And if so, to what extent?
So, not in the formal sense, in the sense that the model is fundamentally a again, supply-driven model. It's based on a starting flock number, and then kind of attaching some of like what we know essentially happens as the result of that. We then are able to forecast forward, future flock numbers and future supply and production and so on and so forth. Once we have those numbers, as we've discussed, we then go out and do the fairly broad consultation. And that's where kind of all of these other factors come into play, because if there are things that aren't included in the model, but then we do need to kind of consider, then we do think about those, but we don't include it in the core kind of original numbers that come up. So to answer the question, because it's that supply-oriented model, it's definitely something that we thought about, but we didn't like formally generate an estimate or anything like that. That's not how these numbers are put together. It's fundamentally supply-driven.
In the consultations we do with industry, it was noted that with the numbers where the model is, that does allow for the supply of animals to Morocco or a boat at least to Morocco in the 2025-2026 period.
Great, thanks, Tim. And Steve, I'll just go next to you, Steve, if that's okay. Predictions, sorry, may also be for Aaron. Just allocating make sure we have enough time to speak. Do you have predictions for ewe numbers and changes in breed composition for the ewe base?
Yeah, so with the, I guess, winding back of ABS reporting on information, we don't get that granular breeding ewe figure and breed figure from the ABS, but MLA have created a sheep producer intention survey that goes out to all producers to still receive this information and put it back into our projections forecasts. So they have forecast quite a stable breeding ewe base nationally, but with the high levels of mutton slaughter that we saw at the tail end of last year, we can definitely assume that that base has come back. We'll get an update on those figures from the May wave of the survey, and then we'll incorporate that into our September forecasts. For the breeding ewe breeds, a question in that survey does ask, of your breeding ewes, what proportion of them are each breeds, and we have seen, as Steve and a few of us have mentioned, a move away from merinos, increased proportions of prime lambs, and then also, very interestingly, a pretty significant jump, though still a small portion of the total flock, a significant jump in shedding type breeds. So we do get a lot of this information. It's all fed back into our model, and that's through the sheep producer intention survey. And I guess a little promotion of that survey, please look out for that when it comes through in May and October.
All I'd add is Aaron's nailed it, is we have seen a doubling in the number of shedders from 4 to 8% in that survey of the flock. And we've seen merino numbers drop from 70s to 64%, I believe. So we've seen a drop in merino ewe percentages as well.
Thanks, Steve, and thank you very much, Aaron, as well. Steve, while I have you, we have a couple of questions on state breakdowns and state-by-state forecasts. Please, do we do state-by-state breakdowns in regards to projections?
So like Aaron said, it probably follows on quite well and quite segues from Aaron's question, is with the ABS moving out of their surveying and that data, we use our sheep producer intention survey. It's a great resource, as Aaron said, that we do with AWI. So these forecasts are nationally aggregated, because you've got obviously a lot of movement of where animals are processed versus where they bred, or like this year, Aaron and Em talked on it, we had a lot of interstate transfers, and that a lot of store lambs from South Australia and Victoria were sold into New South Wales, and then entered back into Victoria to be processed. So our projections are nationally aggregated, but we do have that resource, which is the Sheep Producer Intention Survey. And what that looks at and provides a number of is the proportion of the flock that are in each state. So if you apply that proportion to the total flock, then that's how we get to state-based in the absence of the ABS data. Got a great provider for our Sheep Producer Intention Survey, so that's quite accurate, great data. What we have seen in that, it touches on what Tim said in the live export space, is we have seen WA share go from 21 down to 17% of the flock, and that is in a falling flock dynamic. So we have seen that WA shrink come through in our data.
Great, thanks, Steve. Tim, I'll send this one over to you. Obviously, very topical today. Are you monitoring the risk of tariffs in the US market? Have you modelled the impact of this?
So that's a two-parter. On the first, are you monitoring the potential for tariffs? Yes, we are aware, and yeah, we're monitoring that and keeping abreast of it quite closely. On the question of have we modelled the impact, and my understanding presently is that because there hasn't been, we don't know the specifics, and so it wouldn't be possible to do that kind of modelling at the present time. If you'd like further information on that, we provided our contact information earlier. And when this goes online, feel free to get in touch with me directly. But my understanding is that there isn't any specific modelling currently on that hypothetical.
Thanks, Tim. I'll keep with you now. Are there any increasing export markets for carcass meat other than the UK that you mentioned?
So the United Kingdom, of course, we've seen quite substantial lifts in export volumes. Looking at the carcass trade specifically, we've seen really very robust lifts in exports in kind of lamb carcasses and mutton carcasses into the Middle East and North Africa region. And that's been fairly broad across that region. It's relatively kind of price and demand sensitive. And so over the last few years, with the big increase in supply, with the big increase in production, we've seen a kind of lift in exports above what you might think. And so it's become a really, really important market for lamb carcasses, and also kind of then diversifying into different types of cuts and whatnot. So the Middle East and North Africa would be the very clear growing market over the past couple of years for carcasses specifically. But then, as we've seen big lift in production, we've seen exports lift, and we've seen the range of markets that we export to lift quite substantially. So we've always had, or not always, but for quite a while now, we've had fairly large volumes going into the United States and China and the Middle East, North Africa and Southeast Asia. And we've seen a kind of increasing diversity of exports into different parts of those markets, but also places that we haven't exported sheep meat into before. So last year, for example, there were some exports that were going into parts of Central Asia or parts of Africa, or markets in Southeast Asia that we hadn't exported into before. So the probably primary increase in carcass trade has been to the Middle East, but we've seen this general uplift in exports as we've seen very, very high production and high exports along with it.
Tim, sorry, I'm just going to move on. Again, one more time for you. The increase in carcass weights, will this over time impact acceptance by overseas customers?
That's a tricky sort of question to answer. And just before I have a stab at answering it, it's worth understanding that most of what I've been discussing today is kind of discussing supply and demand dynamics in a very, very broad sense. And this is a question that has a little bit more to do with kind of consumer trends and consumer preferences in market. So if people are interested in answering this question, again, feel free to reach out to us directly after the fact, and we do have resources on this, but this isn't my area of expertise. And so with that said, the preliminary answer would be that because we export quite a wide variety of kind of grades and product and whatnot, because production is so high, what the carcass weights tell us is that is basically an aggregate, right? But inside of that aggregate, there's still a very large number of light lambs, but then there's also an increasing number of heavy lambs. And what we've seen over the past few years and past decade or so has been a lift in exports of lamb that would traditionally, is usually going to be a bit heavier into markets that prefer that. And I'm thinking particularly here of the United States, where we've exported for quite a while, quite a bit of kind of larger cuts of lamb, heavier lambs. But at the same time, there's still quite a lot of that kind of lighter product going around, which has been exported into some other markets. So again, if you want more information on this, feel free to reach out. But in general, because we produce a fairly wide spread of different product types, we're then able to match the type of product to the market and kind of get the best outcome and best value for money for everyone involved.
And one thing on that, one carcass doesn't just go to one market. That's a processor individual decision, but we've got very good market access, so processors will be making the decision on the different cuts going to different markets depending on the market. So I think the diversity of markets we have access to really allow different cuts based on different sizes and different preferences to go to different markets. The one thing we have seen is it's not just export markets. We've definitely seen a growth, as Em showed in the production and carcass weight slide, is we've seen a growth in carcass weights, and the domestic consumer has also accepted higher carcass weights. So we've seen a real step up, what we used to call a traditional trade lamb. We've seen that those specifications on a trade lamb have moved up over time. So we are seeing, generally, it's not just export markets, it is domestic markets. We've seen a change in terms of weights by any customer increase.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Steve. A similar question, more of a domestic focus. Emily, does MLA have a view on how increasing lamb carcass weights have impacted the marketing and sales volume of Australian lamb?
Yeah, so obviously we've seen that, as Steve and Tim mentioned, that increase in carcass weights, and that's obviously going to impact the domestic market. Where it's going to, in this way, that we're going to see kind of more potentially a specialization in the supply chain, particularly for retailers, because they've made commitments regarding packaging as well as their process of the consumer expectations as well. So they need to have a carcass that fits their consumer needs, as their kind of, they have a lot of feedback through the supply chain. And so if, for example, carcass weights move up, we might see potentially different ways of processing it to make it more palatable for the consumer. In regards to how it could impact sales volumes, that's not something that our team really covers. And if you are interested, you should talk to the marketing team that probably has more information on how lamb carcass weights might impact sales volumes.
Thanks, Emily. Erin, we've got a question about sheep feedlots. Are sheep feedlots expected to increase? What are the predictions for this?
So sheep feedlots is a pretty hard one to get data on. From our sheep producer intention survey, we do get a data point on animals that are turned off which have been fed grain for 35 days or more. And so we've seen that grow from 8% in October 2023 to 15% of animals on grain for 35 days or more in October 2024. That's the data point. We know that grain-fed operations become more popular in the sheep sector in periods of dry conditions, which is probably why we've seen such a big jump in the last 12 months. But in the sheep industry specifically, they're quite easy to turn on and off. So anecdotally, we're hearing a lot of interest around sheep feedlots, but they are still primarily used as that drought mediation sort of technique. In market reports, we're also seeing a lot of grain-fed finished heavy lambs coming through which, yeah, goes along to that anecdotal side. But yeah, from our data, we see there has been a peak, but it's likely that it has been heavily influenced by the conditions rather than a major change in the system.
Thanks, Aaron. What one more here for you. Are you aware of any processor capacity limitations with the increased production forecast?
Production is staying high. It's pretty much bang on or just under where it was last year. So we know that processors are able to process the volumes that are coming through because they've done it last year, do it this year. Something that is interesting and came up quite a bit in our consultations is with the nature of employment becoming a lot more fixed, a lot more reliance on the PALM schemes, those employees become full-time employees that are a fixed cost. Looking forward, we're seeing combined throughput of sheep and lamb coming back a bit, which might actually have the inverse impact on processors have staff and the capacity, they've built their capacity up so high to pull through this high numbers, this really high throughput. If that comes back, they will have to manage the volatility in that and manage their workforce and that. So not a capacity concern in terms of the high supply coming through, but looking forward, maybe some concerns around that supply turning off slightly.
Right, thanks, Aaron. Steve, got a couple of questions left. We are getting close to the end of time that we have available. So, Steve, I've just got a question here. Will merinos have to increase average carcass weights to be competitive with buyers and markets? Do we have any comparisons of average carcass weight between terminal and merino lambs being killed?
That's a really good question. We definitely do. So there was a piece of work done by one of our sister teams last year called the Lamb Compendium, and it actually looked at yield of merino and non-merino lambs and mutton, and it did find that the merinos were lower yielding. So obviously there would be an incentive from a processor and retailer that if you're getting higher yielding animals, that would be a consideration that they would give attention to. But in terms of it, I think it's still going to be an individual decision from a producer, because if a producer is focused on the wool production and in the merino game, it's an individual business decision whether merino carcass weights have to lift. Like we heard from M, retailers prefer a lower carcass weight to where the average is creeping up. So maybe that's an opportunity for merinos. We are hearing through some of the grading systems that merinos do grade very well. So there is, from an meat eating quality perspective, the merinos perform pretty well. So it's not definitive either way. There's a lot of different considerations, and I think a business will have to make the decision based on their own circumstances.
Right, thanks, Steve. More question after we close off. Tim, do you perceive export freight capacity constraints? Do you see them placing any brakes on production and breeding for the sheep meat pipeline?
Most likely not. Specifically, when we're talking about sheep meat, most of Australia's exports go out through the Pacific. They don't go kind of through the Atlantic. They don't go through the Suez Canal necessarily, and so that's been quite unencumbered. So those kind of capacity constraints we don't necessarily see as an issue for sheep meat specifically.
Very good. Thank you, Tim, and thank you everybody else. Thank you, Steve, Aaron, and Emily as well for your contributions. With that, that'll bring the MLA Sheep's Projections webinar to an end. Thank you again for all our participants, and thank you all for coming along. If you could please provide us your feedback as you leave using that same QR code currently displayed, and we'll also send a form that we'll email you after the close of this webinar. We really would like to continue to use these webinars to share our insights and provide feedback from you. Will help shape the future of those events. It's incredibly vital for our team. Again, A recording will be made available shortly, which will be accessed via the MLA website or on our YouTube channel of this webinar. If you'd like a PDF of the slide deck, we can provide that upon request. And finally, if your questions were not answered today, please reach out to the market information team. Any journalists on the call, please also reach out to me if you have any questions. We're more than happy to help you out wherever possible. Thank you again for joining today. Have a wonderful day.